jump off of my last nerve. If you read my series, The People in the Cemetery, then you know that as a small child, I could see. What that means is that I could see, hear, and communicate with those whom have crossed over, transitioned, or died. As a teen and young adult, I lost these abilities for a while. I didn't really care about it and didn't appreciate what some have referred to as the gift. Since regaining the gift, I have often done readings for people, been able to see what people are trying to hide, and been able to help people contact loved ones on the other side. I don't like to converse with the dead as a rule. Let sleeping dogs lay. However, sometimes it is necessary to bring someone peace. The first time I saw Frank, I was on my way into work at a new job. I was working in an emergency room at a small hospital that no one really came to unless they absolutely had no other choice. It was just that bad. As I walked through the ER doors, there stood this extra tall, Caucasian, blonde, blue-eyed older gentleman wearing a lumberjack shirt, jeans, work boots, and a hard hat. As I approached him, I could see the thin stream of blood trickling down from under the hard hat on his left brow. No doubt he had been injured while at work, but not so much that he wasn't alert and oriented. I walked up to him and asked, "Have you been helped?" He didn't respond. He simply walked away from me and out the door. This scene repeated itself again the next day. The third day, I knew what he was. This time, I walked up to him and asked, "I know you're trying to talk to someone. Who is it, and what message are you trying to convey?" He looked at me as if surprised and asked, "Can you tell Mary something for me?" His eyes were sorrowful and full of hurt. I nodded my head in agreement. I started to actually feel his pain and suffering. He couldn't cross over until Mary, his daughter, received his message. His pain was so intense that it took everything I had to stifle the tears welling up in my eyes. "Can you tell her that I didn't mean it? Can you tell her that she was the light of my life and I will love her forever? Can you tell her that for me?" I nodded my head. "Yes. Where is she?" I asked, looking around to see if anyone was watching. "She'll be here in 2 days." 2 days passed. I walked in and was greeted by a new nurse. Her name was Mary. After lunch, I took her into the break room, and after getting her permission, I gave her the message. She broke down crying and hugged me so tight my back cracked. Once she'd pulled herself together, she informed me that I had described her father. His name was Frank, and he was a construction worker. Frank had been hit in the head by a beam and was killed instantly. They'd gotten into a huge argument and hadn't spoken in years. When she was notified of his death, she felt an enormous guilt and hurt that she couldn't get over. I only saw Frank one more time after that. He waved at me from across the parking lot. The smile on his face was bigger and brighter than the noonday sun. The Haunting of Philip Main's True Story. On the 1st June 2008, I moved with my children into a big old farmhouse in the country. This old house was beautiful, high ceilings and lots of room for all the children to play. From the very first visit, strange things happened. My youngest, who was a toddler at the time, was laying on the lobby floor and she was playing with something that was making her giggle. Her hands were straight up in the air and she was talking with it. She pointed up to the ceiling and said, "Look at it, Mommy." I was freaked completely out. As I drove up the old private road, my youngest kept waving out her side window, laughing and saying, "I be back, I be back." I watched her through my mirror but only stopped the car when her brother and sister got freaked out. I asked her gently, "Who are you talking to?" She replied, little girl. I was spooked enough, but then she said, she wants me to stay and play. I had no doubt that she saw something and was playing. She seemed happy and unafraid, though the others were scared at the time. This was the first of many things that happened in that old house and its grounds. The Very Angry Woman. This story is 100% real, and there are several witnesses to this story, including myself. Growing up, my father lived in a 3-story house in upstate New York. He would always tell me about the crazy stuff that happened in that house, mostly ghost-related. The summer after I graduated high school, we took a trip to guess where? Upstate New York to visit family. It was just me and my dad who went on the trip. During our trip, me and my dad met up with his brother. For some reason, they decided that they wanted to visit the house that they grew up in. See where this story is going. When we arrived, I noticed how old the houses in the surrounding area were. I'd guess old Victorian style with wrought iron and very tall columns. When we exited the car, I noticed that the house that my dad used to live in and the surrounding 4 houses were condemned. No one lived in them, so we walked through the neighboring house's yard all the way to the backyard. So we are all in the backyard looking up at the old house, and it's pretty big. I gotta cock my head up a lot to see it in its entirety. My uncle, who is in a profession where he shouldn't be scared of anything, all of a sudden gets chills and freaks out looking at the house. He makes a weird sound which causes me to look away from the house and at him. I quickly look away from him and notice there's an old woman literally 3 inches from my face. I recoil because she scared the shit out of me, and I said, "Oh shit." She had no reaction to me and didn't even flinch. She quickly says, "What are you doing in my house? You shouldn't be here. You need to leave now." I look at everyone else and they're staring with their mouths open. Everyone is speechless. Prior to that lady appearing, no one was around. There was no sound that indicated any movement towards us or around us. Listen to this next part carefully. After she says what she says, I immediately say, "I'm sorry, ma'am. We didn't know anyone lived here." As I begin to speak, the woman's face relaxes and her eyes looks as if she's looking past me. She immediately turns right and quickly makes her way into the back of the house nearest to us. I'm following her and apologizing profusely. She enters the rear door threshold. There was no door, and takes a right and is out of view. I enter and turn my head and see no one at the corner of the house. It was at most a quarter of a second that she was out of view. I looked back at my dad and I said, "She just disappeared." Thinking back, when she yelled at me, I felt no breath. She was very real in appearance. Old 70s or 80s, tan skin, purple dress with flower patterns. When my dad wakes up, I'll ask for the address and put it in the comments. Victor and the touch lamp. I used to own a house in central Massachusetts. It was built in 1901, a half-rotten Georgian colonial on a main road. I was foolish to buy it, but I was only 25. It was a romantic wreck. The previous owners were a family that had lived in town for a long time. I had never really met the guy, but I remember him from the time I accidentally hit his son in the gut really hard with a thrown baseball bat. I was 10 and he was pretty old then, so we ended up buying his house after he died. There were a bunch of antiques and stuff. We found a beautiful Honor accordion in a dingy old case in an attic cubby. We knew his name, Victor, and would talk about him often. mostly because of his frugal slapdash repairs and so-called home improvements. So regardless of any potential spiritual presence, his legacy was forefront in our lives, and we were constantly cursing Victor and his nightmarish idea of a handyman. Strange things were perceived in the house, apparitions and whatnot, but not by me. It was kind of fun to believe. We bought this little device that allows you to make any electric incandescent lamp into a touch lamp. The novelty of that was that by plugging the device into the 120-volt electric wall socket and then the lamp into the device, that you could now control the lamp just by touching it. Not only could you turn the lamp on and off just by tapping any metal parts of the lamp, but it also would dim it successively through different brightness levels. Spiffy. One night, we were watching TiVo in the next room. The house was dark and we just had the lights of the TV. Suddenly, the hallway lit up with light from the bedroom, which was the next room over. The bedroom touch lamp had come on by itself. I got up from the couch, walked into the bedroom, and tapped the lamp to cycle it back to the off position. I went back to the living room and sat down on the couch again. Very shortly after that, the bedroom lamp turned on again, but it didn't stay on. It began to very quickly cycle, dim, medium, bright, off, over and over, rapid fire. My wife, or fiancée, or whatever she was at that point, and I looked at each other. I was a bit scared because it had never before exhibited anything like this rogue autonomous behavior. Trying to be funny, I yelled out, "Victor, knock it off!" Instantly, the light went off. It stayed off. That was the only time that happened. We ended up disconnecting it shortly after that, out of fear that it would happen again. Perhaps in the wee hours when we were fast asleep. Nope, bye-bye. So, yeah, it was probably a defective touch lamp switch device. Still scared the butterella out of me that night. It was one thing for the light to start controlling itself, but to stop the instant that I called out the ghost name. I sure don't miss that house. Encounter with the devil. Before I start this story, it's important for me to clarify that the paranormal here in the United States isn't seen the same as it is in Mexico, from where my father is from and from whom I heard this story. Here, at least from my experience, it's seen as nothing more than a cool and sometimes taboo subject to be into, and sometimes people consider it to be a sort of hobby. In Mexico, on the other hand, it's seen from a much different point of view. It's part of our culture. The same stories our great-grandparents heard are the same ones that are passed down to us. La Llorona, Duendes, Nahuales, Brujas, and even the devil himself. We are taught to treat these things with respect and to never take them lightly. To us, it's much more than just witnessing an old chair move on a blurry security cam, or maybe hearing footsteps in an empty room. It's part of our culture. My father is not the type of man to seek attention. He's a humble, honest, hard-working man, and as a result, I wholeheartedly believe him. Since he could remember, he had the misfortune of being more sensitive to the paranormal than most. What I mean by this is that all throughout his life, he has found himself face to face with most of the stories we are warned about. Even now, as a grown man, our entire family has grown accustomed to experiencing more than our fair share. It's almost as if this sort of stuff follows not only him around, but us too. This particular story takes place in Mexico when he was maybe 8 or 9. He was accompanying his grandfather, who at the time worked as a watchman at one of his friend's stores. This specific store also functioned as a warehouse, similar to stores like Costco or Sam's Club, but on a much smaller scale. Bodega Aurrera, for those of you wondering. It was around 11 o'clock when they arrived, well past sunset and into the night. My great-grandfather and his friend had struck a deal, and whenever he was on his shifts, he could help himself to anything he wanted to eat as long as he kept a list in order to make sure it wasn't marked down as stolen inventory. As they were getting ready for the night, my dad was told that he could choose anything he wanted to eat. My dad was excited to hear this, as it wasn't often that he was given the opportunity to choose anything from the store that wasn't a necessity without having to worry about having enough money to pay for it. He wanted to make sure he made the most of his opportunity and decided to go around the store looking for what he wanted the most. He finally made up his mind and settled on a bottle of chocolate milk. He started to make his way around the store and eventually found himself wandering the halls in search of the refrigerator aisle. After figuring out it was in the very back of the store, he hurriedly rushed towards the low buzzing hum of the dozens of refrigerators. After running past the aisles and suddenly turning onto the very last one, all he remembers was an indescribable feeling of not only pure terror and true fear, but also an endless sense of despair. As he turned the corner, he was face to face with a tall, thin man. My father tells me this man had to have been at least 2 meters tall. His initial reaction was to try and run away from him, but he couldn't. It was more than just being paralyzed with fear. He felt an endless empty pit inside him, as well as around him. He doesn't remember the face of that man, and he doesn't know how much time passed. He had lost his sense of where he was, and at the time could not for the life of him tell anything except for the fact that it was him and the man in front of him. He does remember, however, that this man was neatly groomed and seemed very well kept. Despite not remembering his face, he does recall that he was staring straight at him. He does not remember what happened after. He only remembers coming to his senses on the floor in his grandfather's arms, being questioned about what had happened. His face was full of tears. All he could manage to choke out was that the man was there, over and over. His grandfather's first thought was that someone had broken in, and he rushed my father back to the front of the store where the only lockable room was located, the owner's office. He told my father to wait inside the office and that no matter what, to not open the door for anyone. He would be back soon as he checked the store to make sure it was safe. But the memory of the man was still all too fresh in my father's mind, and he decided he'd rather brave running into the man again with his grandfather by his side rather than remain alone inside the store again. Despite his grandfather believing it wasn't safe, he could see the terror in my father's eyes and complied with my father's wish. After checking through each and every corridor and deciding that the store was safe, they both headed back to the office where my dad explained everything. For the most part, it seemed to be an isolated incident, as my great-grandfather later that morning told the owner what had happened, and he claimed it was the first he had heard of anything of the sort happening inside the store. It is worth noting, however, that the store was torn down 2 months later after this incident, and the owner seemed to give no more of an explanation other than he was losing money. Despite my dad not daring to outright say what he thinks he saw that night, it's more than apparent to me that based on his description of both the man and the feelings that overcame him, I think it's safe to assume that the man he saw was none other than the devil. The demolition of the store does nothing but further fuel the theory as to what it was my father saw that night.